Hello, and welcome to the Well Bible Reading Journey podcast, episode number 42. Today we're going to be covering in the Old Testament, Numbers chapters 31, 32, and 33, Psalm chapter 41, and in the New Testament, Mark chapter 13. There's a lot of stuff to cover. We're glad that you're coming along with us on this journey, and I pray that each podcast will help you in maybe sometimes different ways, but mainly we want you to hear Jesus as he speaks to you through the power of his word. We believe that Jesus is in every word of scripture and that he will use it to speak to your life. And that's our hope today. So as we go through the scriptures this morning, I hope that you will listen and open up your heart and your mind and your soul to what Jesus has to say to you. We're going through it every day, one chapter a day, every day, 5 days a week. And so it's just a great exercise, a great spiritual exercise for your life. Thanks for coming on the journey with us. And once again, today I have Amber and Craig with me. Amber and Craig, welcome, and thanks for being a part of it today. Okay, so let's just jump right in. And we're in Numbers chapter 31, right off the bat. It's a really hard chapter. I mean, there's some tough stuff going on here. My Bible, the heading of it is the vengeance over the Midianites. And God is calling for Israel, the people of God, to take vengeance upon these Midianites. And he's chastising them through Moses because they didn't kill all the women. And he really commands them to kill all these women who were the ones who were seducing the men, not to necessarily, there was sexual seduction involved, but really the bottom line is seducing them to this polytheistic world. And so you have this going on here. It can be hard for modern eyes or ears to read this or to hear it because it sounds kind of awful. God is calling them to kill women. So what's going on here? So let's just kind of take it one step at a time. And Craig, share with us some of the things that you pulled out of chapter 31 or 32 or 33.
Yeah, starting at the first of chapter 31, we see God commanding Israel to attack and destroy the Midianites in vengeance for the deception that the Midianites committed on the Israelites in Numbers 25. And to your point, this was a spiritual harlotry. That's harsh words, but that's the terms that were used in the sense that the Israelites were spiritually unfaithful to God. They were called to be his people, and they went off and worshipped in this polytheistic structure or belief system that the Midianites had set up. And so this is God calling Israel to a holy war to establish a protected space for themselves to be able to continue to grow in their relationship with him.
Right. And and you have to keep the context in mind at all times. This was a different world from any world that we know of, that we live in. There was this fierce battle going on where Israel is the only nation in the world, now we know, but certainly in the Mediterranean world, that was monotheistic. And they were surrounded by all these polytheistic tribes and nations. And they're fighting. God is fighting for his people for monotheism, for one God and only one God. And it was a fierce, hard, and sometimes violent fight for monotheism, for the worship of the one true God. And that required things that sometimes are hard to hear. Yeah.
That's exactly what I wrote down. I think the word vengeance strikes us as like it's uncomfortable for us. And also you're like, how is this consistent with God's love and God's character, especially when you see Jesus himself say, love your enemies. So how is this consistent with God's love? And so as you kind of wrestle with that, you got to remember that actually there's oftentimes in scripture where when it's evil is when we try to put vengeance in our own hands. That's when it's evil. But for God, when he is using this people group as an instrument to, like you said, Ellis, to kind of push on this monotheistic view, like it is a fight. It's a literal and spiritual fight. And it was good. It's hard for us to see as good, but it was a good thing to keep spreading forward so we get to where we are today. So yeah, it is hard to kind of wrestle with this idea of God being vengeant, but it is loving in a way.
Yeah, no, there are two schools of thought on this. And you hit on one exactly, Amber, when you said Jesus is the one who said, love your enemies. And he's the only one that I know of who ever said, love your enemies. But the point is that the history of Israel is this long and in some ways continuing to this day. this long battle and struggle for survival, just to survive for whatever reason throughout their history. And I think it's because they're the people of God, but they've had to fight just for survival, just to stay alive as a nation, to keep monotheism alive. And the point would be, and you're I think you're right on, where you say it actually in some ways was loving, because you would never have gotten to love your enemy, which is the epitome of the radical love ethic of Jesus Christ, right? You would never have gotten to love your enemy if you had not fought, if these battles had not been fought for the survival of Israel. Remember, Israel did produce Jesus. Jesus was a Jew, right? He was the Jewish Messiah, the fulfillment of the Jewish scriptures, who came to save the Jew and the Gentile.
Amen.
And so you would never have gotten to Jesus if these battles had not been fought, if these people had, in some ways, if these people had not died in this battle, then you would never have gotten there. The other school of thought, really, go ahead, Craig, go ahead.
Sorry, I was just going to say, play on that thread real quick about Jesus. There's a sense of what I was asking in the sense of this chapter. Why wasn't Moab destroyed also? Because in 25 verse 1, they refer to the daughters of Moab, who are the ones that were going to deceive Israel. Of course, later it comes down to the women of the Midianites also. So question is, for me, the Midianites were destroyed. Why not Moab also? Well, one, we know the Midianites were ruling the lands of Moab. So there's a sense that maybe they weren't, real free agents here to be held responsible by God. But secondly, in redemption history, Ruth comes from the line of Moab. And of course, we know she marries Boaz, and they have King David, and Jesus comes from the line of David. So there's a sense we don't always know where God is going with his decisions. And so it's hard to question, in the moment or even 2,000 years later with our own limited knowledge. This is God's justice in play, but he also is countering and balancing that with his mercy and his grace. And all of that, we're going to continue to struggle through all that, not only in Israel's history, but in the history of the church and in the history of mankind, because that only comes together and is held in tension by Jesus himself.
That's right. That's a good catch with Ruth and how she was a Moabitess, right? They actually have David's grandfather, but eventually it's David, right? The line of David goes through there, so that becomes an important part of the history as well. The other school of thought on this, by the way, is just those who would say, that vengeance belongs to God, not to human beings. Vengeance is mine, thus saith the Lord, right? So when it talks about vengeance and what happens in this awful war, people are dying, people are being slaughtered, and you're asking, how could God do this? And the other school of thought is, who are you to question God? This is God. Vengeance is God's. It doesn't belong to us. We shouldn't take vengeance. But when God says, do this, this is my vengeance, then there is a school of thought that would say, we can't question God on that. He knows what he's doing. And of course, nowadays it's hard, but we're not supposed to question, or we're supposed to accept when it is God's vengeance. We have to accept that his will is being done, and just know that there is good that's going to come out of it. It would not happen if there weren't good coming out of it, right? So that's a really part. The other thing that's hard for us as Christians is, and I would think more as Western Christians, because in Western theology and Western Christianity, what has developed, and part of it may be the rise of science and the Enlightenment and all that, is that we really want to have an answer for everything. We're uncomfortable with living in mystery. We're uncomfortable with living with the parts of God that we can't explain. But the Eastern thought is very much comfortable with that. The Jewish religion is very comfortable, they understand that sometimes they live inside the question, and the question is not going to be answered on this side of eternity. And that God is a mystery, that there's this mysterious side to God, that there are things you can't answer. And if you could answer everything, it probably wouldn't be God, right? If we understood everything, that we would question whether or not it's really God, that it would be man-made if we could answer everything. And so we have a hard time living in that sometimes, that uncomfortable place where we don't have all the answers because we want the answers. So that's chapter 31.
Now, just real quick to close that out, I've even heard it said in church history, all the heresies that have come up in our own dialogues and disputes. I've heard it said the heretics are the ones that say too much.
Yeah, that's right. The ones who have an answer for everything. If you have a pastor or someone your friend that has an answer to everything, Yeah, that might be a clue to be careful.
I
So
have
then, go
I
ahead.
have actually two more things in this chapter. I'm going to
Go.
squeeze them in real fast.
No,
The,
go.
the first thing is the very first line is super easy to read over and miss. Like it's so easy just to read quickly and miss these little details. But it talks about in the very first line in chapter 31, it's talking about the vengeance that the Lord has. But it's funny how it describes, it says, God avenges Israel. And the next line, it's Moses talking to the people. And Moses says, we're going to avenge the Lord. And that's
Mhm.
really interesting that it shifts. And it's, I think it's supposed to be this idea of God and Israel being so united that they're almost one and the same. And if God is so jealous of his people, then they surely should be jealous for him and fight for his glory. Like, and that's sort of what I was reminded of myself. Like, God is so jealous of me. Am I willing to step forward and also be united in a way that I need to be jealous for him as well?
No, that's good. Yeah, and in the Old Testament has this concept of God being so united with his children, the children of God, that there's this kind of marriage that takes place there between God and his people. The same way that with Jesus and the church as described in the New Testament, when Saul is persecuting the church, Jesus stops him. Jesus says, "Saul, Saul, why are you persecuting me?" He was persecuting the church, but
Right.
it's the same thing as persecuting Jesus. So that so the vengeance that's for the Lord is also for the people of Israel because they're so tied together. Great catch, easy to miss.
And the other thing I have in this chapter really fast is that it's interesting after they defeat them, they come back with all the spoils and all the things. It's interesting how God is described of what to do with them, and it says anything that can stand the fire, you shall have it pass through the fire, and it shall be clean. Nevertheless, you should also purify it with water for its impurities. And I just thought that was interesting because it's God actually I think uses the same means of purification for our believers today. I think He uses fire of trials as well as water and baptism. I think it's both things to purify us even still today.
No, that's good. There's no doubt about that. I learned more about God and from God in the difficult times. I learn more from my failures than I do from my victories in the good times.
Right.
And it's in the hard times that you really hear God so clearly, as opposed to the good times when everything's fine. You're just not as hungry because you're fine. Everything's fine, right?
Yep.
It's when you're hungry. That's for sure.
When we get to
Okay.
Job, we'll talk about this a lot.
Oh, yes, yes, yes. So that's chapter 31. Chapter 32 was interesting to me too. These Transjordan tribes, Reuben and Gad, and they don't want to go into the promised land. And it's fascinating to me because you would think, excuse me, by this time Moses is leading them. Joshua's going to lead them over. That everyone's just going to line up behind Joshua, and everybody's just excited to get in the promised land. But as it turns out, no, they're not. Right? There are two tribes that don't even want to go, and so they have this kind of this. Moses gets upset with them, and so what did you guys get from that? Craig, we'll start with you. Kind of some of the things that you pulled out of there.
Yeah, just the parallels. The parallels are obvious, and Moses calls them out. The parallels between the tribes of Gad and Reuben here are reenacting what happened 38 years previously with the spies who had gone into the promised land to reconnoiter the land and come back to report back to the Israelites. That was their mission, but they came back and basically talked their peers out of wanting to go into the promised land. And so that showed a lack of faith in God, a lack of belief in what he had said. He said that the promised land is yours. They're like, I don't know about that. They got a lot of giants in there we're kind of afraid of. So
Yeah.
let's just kind of hang out. And God's like, okay, you don't have to go in, but you're going to be out here wondering on, kind of,
Yeah.
he
Yeah.
says on your own, kind of implying, I know he stays with them, but
Yeah.
it's not the same, right? So here Moses is scared again. This is going to reenact. And so he kind of has a reaction, doesn't he? He's like, you guys are doing it again. In verse 11, the term of, God is the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob appears for the only time in Numbers. And this is a call to faith. And the relationship that God has with his people is based on faith. And it's not the sense that Reuben and Gad here are breaking a law that Moses and that God through Moses has set up. It is a breach of faith and belief in what God has called them to do and following him and following God over the Jordan.
Yeah.
That's a good catch on I love what you said about the it's a breach of faith. And for Moses, my contention is that most of what Moses did with the people was just constantly reminding them of who they are. This is who you are. You worship the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, and you keep forgetting that there were two spies who wanted to go in the promised land in the scene you're talking about, Craig, and that was Caleb and Joshua, and they do get to go in the promised land. And Moses has to be frustrated because here these tribes don't want to go in, and Moses is going, do you know, I would give anything to go in, right? He's not getting to go in. I would give anything to be able to see what you're going to see and to experience what you're going to experience, and you don't want to go in. So that had to be frustrating for him. What did you get, Amber? You saw something in here as well.
Yeah, what's interesting is that just because Moses kind of agrees to their compromise, it doesn't mean it was the right move. We sometimes we forget that. Like, Moses is still human, and he just because he's like, okay, I can go with that compromise, it doesn't mean it was the right move, because they really are doing something we've seen before. We keep seeing this pattern throughout the Pentateuch. It is written in a way that you see the same pattern of behavior as humans from Genesis 1 through 9. And we are right here again at the fall, and it has language to help us help with that. So you see language like, they saw the land. They saw this land. They think, you know what? We conquered this land. I know the whole all the Israelites help us defeat and get this land, but I think I like the way it looks. I think it's good for my herds.
It's pleasing, right? It's pleasing.
It's very pleasing to my eye. I think that we could be fed here. We could survive well here. And so they see with their own eyes and in their own wisdom, if you will. And then it also says here, they kind of ask permission. They said, if we are in your favor, then give this land to us. That's exactly what it uses in the Adam and Eve story. It says that she saw what was good in her own eyes, and then she gave it to Adam. And so this is that same language. So as meditators of the word, when we pick up these little pieces of notes of Genesis 1 through 9, we should go, oh, this is a pattern. So what you see is this is the pattern of the fall. And so although nothing directly happens here, we will see later, I think it's in Numbers or Kings, that's in Kings, in 2 Kings, we will see that their decision to be on this east side of the Jordan is actually going to come back and bite them a little bit, because they're going to be the first ones picked off and taken over. And we'll see that in 2 Kings. But anyways, this is not necessarily a great thing. Here.
No, it comes back. It comes back to hurt them. Sometimes we see things. It looks good for right in the short term. It looks great and awesome and wonderful, but in the long term, it's not good. It's kind of the easy road as opposed to the narrow road or the hard road. And they're taking the easy road. And Moses, that's what Moses holds them to. He says, "You guys are trying to take the easy way out. Well, you can stay here." To Amber's point with the compromise, you can stay here. But I'm not going to make it easy on you. You're going to have to come in and fight with us. You don't get to get out of the battle. You're going to have to be part of the battle. And so that was the compromise, to your point, Amber. And I think in some ways they agreed to it. They it's almost begrudgingly, but yeah, we'll go and fight with you. But even when they say that, we'll go fight with you, but first we're going to fortify our city. We want our women to be in fortified cities.
Yes.
So there's another kind of almost a breach of faith that you were talking about, Craig, with where you're not trusting God. God has told you to go into this land, and you're not trusting Him. So I think that's an excellent point, Amber, where we can do things and God will let us, but that doesn't mean it's what's best for us. If we've compromised, God will let us live in that compromise, so that we will learn through the hard times that will come to these tribes. To your point, they're going to be the first ones picked off. They're vulnerable. They're living outside the Holy Land. They're vulnerable. So yeah, and it even divides their own tribes. You have the half tribe of Manasseh. They go into either side. So even within one tribe, they couldn't agree, right? And there was this division.
1 John reminds us that two things are going to cause us to sin more than anything else. It's our eyes and our pride. And the eyes part is really obvious to me because it talks about how they saw it. So that one's really obvious. But the pride one, I think this one's a little harder to catch. But I think if you meditate long enough, you can kind of pick it out. Is that reminded that Reuben is the eldest son, and so but he lost his birthright. And so what happens is that you have the eldest son. they're typical brothers, right? They're
Mhm.
fighting. They always are trying to one up each other. You have the eldest son who's going to enter the promised land, and he knows he's not going to get the best lot. He knows he's not going to get the best land. He's not going to get the best of, because he lost that birthright a long time ago. And so you have this tribe who their pride might have said, you know what, if we stay on this side, look how great this land is. We could
Mhm.
keep all this for us. And Gad too. Gad is actually the oldest of one of the women,
Yes.
as well. So, anyways, both of them have lost their birthright, and they're like, maybe we'll just stay on this side. So I think it's eyes and pride here that's
No,
causing this.
absolutely. There is an element of pride when you say the promised land represents God, what God is giving them. And it's almost like saying, well, I don't need God really. I'm good. I'm good here. I can do it on my own. I can do it outside the parameters of the promised land. I can make it okay out here. And there's a certain amount of arrogance in that, in and of itself. Yeah, that's
Ellis, have
good.
you Ellis, have you ever had a moment in your life where you're like, okay, I feel this calling and God is leading me to this great thing and I'm work really hard to get there and you're almost there and you're pretty content with where you are. I'm feeling pretty comfortable where you are. Maybe it's far enough. Maybe
Hmm.
that's what God called me to, but right here I'm pretty comfortable. I've done enough, right, Lord? This is far enough. I think we do
Yeah.
that still today if we're not careful.
Oh,
Yeah, and that's
absolutely.
like that's exactly what they're doing here, right? I mean, we like this land, even though all of our fellow Israelites helped us conquer this, and we helped. We were part of a bigger army. This is an Israelite thing. It wasn't just Gad and Reuben who conquered this land, but we'll just take it for ourselves because I don't know why we're special. I guess
Yeah.
we got the herds, so it makes sense. But I
Yeah.
mean, why do they get? Moses is probably thinking, why do they get to sit here on land that everybody conquered, and then the rest of us have to go off and conquer, and take the danger of war throughout the promised land? They have to
Yeah.
have some skin in the game, right?
No, yeah, an excellent picture of how the greatest enemy of the best thing is the good thing. It's good,
Mhm.
but it's not the best. And sometimes it's the greatest enemy because you get to where the good is. You think, oh, hey, this is good enough. I'm happy here, and you miss out on the
Right.
best that God had for you, which was much better than good. There's a Grand Canyon of a difference between the good and the best, right?
Right.
And so they missed out on the best because they were happy with the good, and maybe in some ways didn't trust. There is this element too that they didn't trust that we can really pull this off going over there, right? These people, why do we want to go? Jericho was a walled city. It was a very ancient city. It was an established city, and that's the first battle they're going to have to go into against a walled city. They'd never seen walled cities before. They'd never experienced this. So it's one of those things that we're not sure that this is a good idea, right? Even though it was God's idea. Back to the spies, right? We're not sure this is a good idea. Yeah, that's definitely going on. That's chapter 32. A lot to learn there. Chapter 33 is interesting. It's just, we won't spend a lot of time on it. It's just really a list of all the places they went. It's almost like they pause and they talk about all the places they went. One of the biggest things I get out of that is really just it's a look back, right, all the way back to Egypt and coming out of Egypt. The first thing I get from reading is this sense of, man, they wandered around all over the place. They were moving. This was a nomadic tribe of hunters and gatherers. They were traveling all over that area from place to place, probably looking for water. Water was a big thing. Looking for shade, looking for grasslands for their herds and their flocks, even though they had manna and quail, but they also had goats and sheep and that kind of thing. So yeah, they just went to a lot of places. Did you guys pick anything out of this chapter?
Man, I as I was looking through here, is a 2-week journey, and it's supposed to be, and instead they ended up in having 42 different encampments.
Yeah,
That's a lot.
I think I'm reminded of Gilligan's Island, a 3 hour tour, right? It's
That's
supposed to be
right.
a 3 hour tour, and it turned into, I don't know, 2 seasons of Gilligan's Island.
That's
Anyway,
right.
yeah,
And so that kind of stood out to me, but also at the very beginning is a slight little narrative at the very, very beginning that kind of really stood out to me as it talks about this moment, like you said, Ellis, it talks about them leaving Egypt. It actually describes it as this triumphal place where they left. And I was just reminded once again, we haven't been here in a while, that they were enslaved people, but God gave them the boldness to leave as conquerors and not to escape like slaves. And I just think that was reminded here for me.
oh, that's good. Yeah, absolutely. And they continuously remember that, and been 3,000 years, and they're still talking about coming out of Egypt. And in his Israel, the Jewish faith is such a faith of history. It's entrenched in history, and that's why it's so important, guys. As we read the Bible, as we see archaeology has confirmed these stories over and over again. I was in Jericho not that long ago. The tell where they are excavating that city, that ancient city. We were on the bus. We passed a sycamore tree, and I go, "Look, Priscilla, there's a sycamore tree." She goes, "Is that the one Zacchaeus climbed up?" And I go, "Probably not the exact tree, but it is a sycamore tree." No, it's just steeped in history,
Yeah.
and history is so important to them, and all of their festivals and all their stories that they repeat every year again and again, teach their children. It's all about the history, and you see it here. They take the time to stop and recount every single place they've been. First of all, they took the time to document it and write it down, all the places that they had been. But they also paused to remember, and I think there's something powerful about that of remembering. Look at where we've been. Sometimes we don't take the time to do that. Look at how far we've come, and to celebrate that, right? To celebrate how far we've come. I almost think that this chapter may be just that in and of itself, saying, "Look at how far we've come. We're about to enter the promised land, and we've been to all these places." Right?
Yeah.
Yeah, and I would add real quick, just piggybacking on your point, Ellis, about the Jewish faith being a faith of history, and I think that's spot on. And it's a great point. We generally don't credit the Jewish people for, because at least in our Western mind, we generally credit the Greeks, of inventing history. We also generally invent the Romans and maybe later Christians and Paul, especially, of inventing the individual, of the conception of the self. But throughout the Psalms, you see ideas of self also.
Mm-hmm.
So all these ideas of self and of the flow of time and the the story of us as a people, all come from the Jewish faith. You talked about monotheism earlier, of course, but all these things that spring out of that monotheistic faith that we take for granted today are just incredible.
Yeah, no, and Solomon said it. Solomon looked at everything. He looked at all the history of Israel, and he looked at everything that they had learned. He said, "Nothing new under the sun." It's all kind of just repeating and learning from each other, and it's all there. So that's really excellent as they come out of all that, all the places that they've been as a people, and taking time to just remember, guys, and to celebrate how far you've come and what God has done in your life. Super, super important. Okay, before we leave Numbers, anything else from Numbers? Did we leave anything out? Okay, so let's go to Mark. We're going to skip Psalm chapter 41 is a great Psalm. Take time to read it and meditate on it. But we're looking at Mark chapter 13, another big chapter out of Mark. Here, Jesus goes on this kind of rant about the temple, and it seems like maybe, the title on my Bible of this section is Signs of the End of the Age. Of course, the question, the controversy is, well, which age? Which age is he talking about? And what exactly is he talking about? I know Craig and Amber, y'all have a little bit of different kind of perspective. I don't think they're contrary to each other. They're just different perspectives on maybe what he was talking about here. So, and it is controversial. But so, Craig, let's start with you. Kind of your take on this chapter and what you get out of it.
Yeah, my take on this chapter is, usually people will focus on Mark 13, marry it with what Paul says about the end times along with Revelation, and try to pack it all into a sequence of events that'll happen when culminate Jesus' return. And of course, I believe Jesus is returning. That's confirmed in the Bible, not only by Jesus himself, but by Acts and the subsequent letters of the apostles. So throughout the Bible, it's made obvious. But what I see in this chapter is this isn't actually about the end of the world. It's not about that. This isn't about Jesus' second coming. What this is about in the context of Mark, what Mark has been building up to since the start of chapter 11, is what about the temple? If Jesus is he said a number of times that he's going to destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days. The temple will be risen in 3 days. Eventually that will get him in trouble at his trial, right? You think you can destroy the temple? It's taken decades to build. You're going to rebuild it in 3 days. He's obviously saying he's the new temple, right? So if he's the new temple, what about the old temple? Well, here we get the answer in this chapter. anybody who's read Josephus's history of the Jewish people throughout the first century AD, and if you haven't, I encourage you to pick it up and read it. It's out there on the internet for free. Just search on Josephus, you'll get his writings. But when he talks about the Jewish war in AD 66 through 70, that's the war where the Jews revolted against Roman rule. The Romans come in and ultimately into Jerusalem and squash the Jews and ultimately take over and disperse them. That's where we get the Jewish diaspora from. But as part of that, they come in and defile the temple and destroy it. And so in 70 AD, we get the final destruction of the temple. And actually, that's, if nothing else, confirmed by the verses near the end of chapter 13, verses 30 and 31, where Jesus talks about, I say to you, this generation will not pass away until all these things take place. So, he's saying, those of you I'm talking to, you disciples, some of you will still be around when what I'm talking about is going to happen. So, all that to say, the parallels between Jesus's prophecies here and Josephus's writings as history of what happened in Jerusalem as the Romans came over and the temple fell, eerily similar, right? So
Yeah.
So that's what I see in this chapter.
Yeah. The best date for Jesus's death and crucifixion and resurrection is 30 AD. The temple is destroyed in 70 AD. That's 40 years later. That's considered usually more or less a generation is 40 to 50 years. So he's saying this generation will not pass away when these things will happen. So obviously it seems to me, he's talking about that destruction. Not one stone will be left on top of the other. All of that's playing out. And the context, the framework, you have to remember the context here really is they are talking about the temple. The question that started, or the comment that started this whole discussion, was that the disciples saying, "Look, teacher, what massive stones, what magnificent buildings," talking about the temple. And they were magnificent. Herod was known as this amazing builder, and he built the temple. He built a lot of things during his time, but the temple in Jerusalem was his most magnificent accomplishment, and it was considered one of the 8 wonders of the ancient world. People would travel from all over the world to see this temple. One of the most amazing things about it was that it was up and it was in this high elevation. How did you get all those stones up there, right? So they just marveled at it. So it was something to marvel at, and the disciples are doing that, and Jesus tries to correct them. It's a corrective on this, right? So there is certainly that take, and I think that's right on. Amber, you see a little bit more in this too. You go on to see not maybe that, but something else too.
Yeah, you're exactly right. And the best thing about eschatology is that it is not the most important things. It's not the gospel.
Right.
It's not
That's right.
salvation. And so you can disagree with loving
Yeah.
believers. And that's what's so beautiful about eschatology and having great conversations. But in this section here, I agree that it's definitely talking about the temple mostly at the beginning here. He's talking about the temple. And I think it's interesting. Skeptics, it's Jesus's prophecy about the destruction of the temple is so pointed and so right on that even skeptics try to say that Mark was written much later than it was, just to try to get around the issue. But we know that Mark was written really early, one of the earliest gospels written way before the temple was destructed. And this is a beautiful prophecy that Jesus says, and it is incredible. But he goes on to give more. And I think the reason why I think for me, I can see why it's hard to see is because even the disciples didn't understand there was going to be 2 comings. And so the way he describes it, it almost is like he's just given them one big piece of information, but they are 2 different things. You have the temple that's going to be destroyed, and you're going to have these signs of his second coming. And the one thing I do want to clarify is for those who do see this as Jesus' second coming, oftentimes they use all of these wars and rumors of wars and pestilence and all these things as the signs. And I actually disagree with that. I think Jesus says these are not the signs. I think he says these are not the signs. These have always happened, will continue to happen forever and ever. And they're only going to get more and more rumors and more as we get closer to 2,000 years since Jesus's death. It's going to get more and more ramped up. These are not the signs, but I think he does go on to tell you what the sign is. And the sign are the abomination of desolation. And then you can use a lot of pieces of scripture from Daniel to Revelation to 2 Thessalonians. You use these scriptures to partner. What does that mean? The abomination of desolation.
Right.
And what does that mean? And when you do that, for me, I don't see that as the temple. I see that doesn't fit the same temple theme. That hasn't happened yet. This is the not yet. And then right after it says, once that does happen, here's what's going to happen. The coming of the Son of Man is going to happen. He's going to come on a cloud with my favorite part, with power and glory, which is the opposite of when he came in as loneliness. And he came on a donkey before, and now he's going to come in a cloud and power. I just love these beautiful imagery.
Yeah. And Son of Man is right out of Daniel. It was Jesus's favorite title for himself at that time. I totally agree with you on the signs. Those have always happened. They've always been with us. That doesn't necessarily point to anything. The point he's trying to make is, stop trying to look for all these signs. People are always looking at earthquakes and all this. Say, oh, he's coming, he's coming. But he says in verse 32, no one knows that day and hour. This is something some people miss too and this is really important for our Christology, our understanding of Jesus, who he was, especially the incarnate Jesus, because it says no one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, capital S, talking about himself. He said, Jesus saying, even I don't know, but only the Father, right? God the Father is the one who knows, which tells us that the incarnate Jesus was not omniscient, because if there's even one thing you don't know, guess what? You're no longer omniscient. Omniscient means all-knowing, right? So that the incarnate Jesus was not omniscient. That Paul tells us that when he went into the incarnation and came to earth, he emptied himself. The divine Jesus, the eternal Jesus, who was in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. That Jesus emptied himself of his divine prerogatives. He emptied himself of things in order to become like one of us. And obviously, one of those was his omniscience, because he says, even I don't know when that day and hour, only the Father knows that. So that's an important word to all of us, especially when you're tempted to buy that book that has all the charts and is telling you that they know the date that he's coming. Right. It says clearly that he doesn't, right? He doesn't know. But he's trying to give us some framework to work with, right?
Yeah.
And really the ultimate goal of eschatology and all of it, the apocalyptic literature was very popular during this time period. We have only one example of it in the Bible. That's the book of Revelation. But it was really meant, we get into the charts and the wanting to know. And again, as I said, we are very uncomfortable living in mystery. We don't like mystery. We want to know, right? But the real objective of apocalyptic literature in Jesus's day, and what you're seeing here, was for assurance, to assure us God's got this, right? That in the end, the main thing about apocalyptic literature is God wins in the end. No matter how you interpret it, at the end, God wins, and he has this. He knows all these things. So we don't have to. And we don't have to worry about it. And particularly for you guys out there, you don't have to fight about it or who's right or who's wrong, right? There are all these kind of different beliefs. And Craig, you kind of mentioned those.
Yeah, so there's generally three classifications of views that we think about when it comes to the end times and how we approach, the apocalypse and eschatology and eschatological doctrine. We get what the future side of things, which is generally around what the millennialist views. Premillennial, postmillennial, amillennial, and then we get into, if some people think everything that Jesus has prophesied has already happened, including the second coming. That's called preterism, or the preterist view. And that's actually a heresy, because as Orthodox Christians, we believe that Jesus is coming again, and that has not happened yet. And that's pretty clear throughout the Bible. He says he's coming again. He's not here. We're not in the new recreated heaven and earth. And so the where I probably come down on is the partial preterist view, because looking at chapters like Mark 13, again, to me, that's based on the context where Mark is taking the story and where he's at. Jesus is talking about the temple's destruction, but not his second coming. That's where we get into 2 Thessalonians, Revelation. There's obviously the bulk of those prophecies are still to happen. So to me, it's a mix, and that's where the partial preterist view is trying to strike that line.
Sure. Okay. Good. Amber, you had something else kind of off of this.
I did. And like Craig was saying, I sort of fall more into the futurist view. So it's interesting. Right. I was telling Craig this earlier and before we talked that it doesn't matter where I fall. Like I'm happy to change my mind if the right person says the right arguments, and I'm happy to change my mind on this topic, even if I'm halfway up to see Christ himself, I'd be happy to change my mind, because at the end of the day, I know he's coming, and I'm
Same
going to be
here.
part of that group.
Yeah.
Yes. What I wanted to say about that is, no matter how you think about this, what I think we need to get from this, no matter where you fall, I think the most important thing to think about is the fact that it's trying to tell us that we need to be waiting and not watching.
Mm-hmm.
Waiting, not watching. When we watch, I can tell you, Christians have made complete fools of themselves trying to watch and make all these predictions and such. We look like idiots sometimes, right? Where it's not about watching, it's about waiting. And what that looks like as we're waiting, the most important thing is live rightly and turn from our sin and keep spreading the gospel and do that kingdom work. Those two things, that we have to be ready. We have to be ready and not be watching.
That's well said. And real quick, and I'll turn it over to you, Ellis. Mark, I can't remember if I've said this story on the podcast before, but it bears repeating if I have. When Martin Luther was asked what would he do if he knew the world was ending tomorrow, he said, "I'd plant a tree."
Yeah, that's good. I like that. I had a professor who would say that the reason so many people are consumed with the second coming is because they don't want to deal with the first coming. It's like he came and he gave us this, and to Amber's point, share the gospel, preach the gospel, be faithful. And people don't want to, that's too hard. Let's chart out the second coming. They want to get into all the controversies and all that. And instead of just really focusing on what God has us doing every day. And for me, it's interesting. All the stuff that we've talked about this chapter is very interesting, but the very first part is really kind of the part that I key into, where Jesus has just finished telling his disciples that the temple system is corrupt, that the Pharisees and the Sadducees and the scribes and the elders who are running this thing are all corrupt. They love the best seats at the banquets. They love the places of honor. They love to give flowery speeches and prayers in public. They love the adulation of the people. But he says, and they love building these beautiful buildings, but they devour widows' houses, right? He says they devour widows' houses. This is blood money. They did this off of the backs of slaves. They devour widows' houses to do this. They take this money from these poor widows on fixed incomes to build all this. And he says it's not about the buildings. And he just has said that to them. And they're leaving the temple to go to Bethany. The sun is setting. The sun is hitting the beautiful white stone of the temple. And the disciples look back and they go, golly, look at these buildings. Aren't they beautiful? And I just picture Jesus going, are you kidding me? I just finished telling you it's not the buildings. And that's when he says, these buildings are not going to be around. A generation will not pass, and you will see this come to pass, and not one stone will be left on the other. You have to remember, that would have been hard to believe. That would have been like hard to believe that this massive structure is going to be gone in less than a generation, right? But to what we discussed earlier, it happened, right, in 70 AD. And Jesus's point is, it's not the buildings, guys. Focus on the most important thing. And the most important thing is Jesus, your relationship with him. This is our prayer for you as you go through these scriptures every day, that Jesus would speak to you and that you would keep the main thing. And the main thing is Jesus in your life and sharing his gospel. So we bless you as you do that. And hope you have a great week studying his word and hearing from him, and can't wait to see you next week. God bless you.
Bye, y'all.
Bye.